Hello, and welcome to the Books Uncovered podcast, a podcast brought to you by Fulcrum Publishing, where we explore the world of books and the people who make up the publishing world and the book industry. I'm Sam Shinta, publisher of Fulcrum Publishing, and joining me today is Kateri Kramer, our director of marketing. Hi, Kateri. How are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you doing?
Excellent, thank you. How's fall back in Colorado treating you?
Well, it finally feels like fall the last maybe 2 days. It's not 84 every day anymore, which is
okay.
Nice. So I took the opportunity to make like 6 dozen Halloween cookies last night.
Oh, wonderful. Well, you're capturing the season already. Yeah, here in Western Wisconsin, we are definitely getting fall. All the colors on the leaves are changing, and they're, of course, falling right off the trees right away. So we get a flash of color and then a lot of leaves to rake up. Well, yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Halloween. This is a special episode. We are firmly in October country, as it were. And I want to just read this wonderful opening from Ray Bradbury's classic October Country. October country, that country where it is always turning late in the year, that country where the hills are fog and the rivers are mist, where noon goes quickly, dusks and twilights linger and midnights stay. That country composed in the main of cellars, subcellars, coal bins, closets, attics and pantries faced away from the sun. That country whose people are autumn people, thinking only autumn thoughts, whose people passing at night on the empty walks sound like rain. And I can't think of a better guest to join us today than Brad Hodson. So originally from Knoxville, Tennessee, Brad Hodson currently hangs his hat in sunny Southern California. A former stand-up comedian, he's also founded an award-winning sketch comedy group and has been published in several national magazines. He's the recipient of the Roselle Lewis Award for Excellence in Short Fiction and the Cornblow Award for Nonfiction, as well as several screenwriting awards. He's written professionally for stage, screen, page, and games, both video and tabletop, and loves storytelling in all of its forms. He is the author of Life on the 64 Bus, which I just picked up a copy of from Amazon the other day. Looking very forward to reading that. And the collection Where Carry-On Gods Dance, and has been called a magician with a pen and a master of atmosphere. When not writing, Hodson is the administrator for the Horror Writers Association, an international nonprofit organization comprised of professional writers and publishing professionals dedicated to promoting the interests of horror and dark fantasy. Welcome, Brad Hodson. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. And thank you for picking up Life on the 64 Bus. I'll be curious to hear what you think.
Yeah, it really hit a nerve with me. It reminds me a little bit of The Lies of Locke Lamore. I don't know if you're familiar with that one. The kind of the gentleman thieves. But it seems, from what I've read so far, a group of misfits and the like that come together and have some dashing adventures in Rome. So looking very, very forward to that book.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for having me on. I'm excited to be here today.
Well, why don't you start by telling us a little bit about the Horror Writers Association and what your role is there and what the group seeks to do?
Yeah, so the Horror Writers Association was founded in the mid-1980s by a couple of guys you may have heard of, Dean Koontz and Robert McCammon, as well with as a few other writers. And it was originally founded as HOWL, the Horror Occult Writers League, I think. Glad they changed their name at some point. But it's been a resource for writers in the horror and dark fiction genres ever since that time, trying to provide educational resources, financial resources, networking opportunities. And as the organization's grown, we've been very happy in the past several years to launch projects like Horror University, where we have online classes that help teach various aspects of writing and the horror genre. And we've also launched several scholarships and most recently a diversity grant to help writers who are struggling because, as we know, it's not a financially lucrative career when you're first starting, and in fact can be a money sink for the educational opportunities. And so we wanted to offer opportunities like that. And the Horror Writers Association, it's grown. I started volunteering in 2010, and we had about 300 members when I started. Today we have 2,200 across the globe.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, we have chapters that have sprung up the last few years in Italy, the UK, Ireland, India. We have members in Singapore and across Africa and Eastern Europe. It's really amazing to see how the organization has grown, but also what that means for the genre. Because obviously, if the organization is growing globally like that, then the genre is doing really well.
Yeah, absolutely. And so how did you, so you said you began volunteering with the group back in 2010. How did you get connected? What motivated you? I know that you have the one collection, the one published collection of scary stories or horror stories but in the vein of Ray Bradbury, if I'm understanding correctly.
Yeah, I love that you quoted the October Country, because that's one of my favorites. I often refer to myself as one of the autumn people. But yeah, when I first started writing, I mean, like probably most people in my generation, one of my biggest influences growing up was Stephen King.
Yeah, heard of him.
And so yeah, you might have. But he yeah, I mean, I remember when I was a kid, the first couple of things I started writing were basically just Stephen King fan fiction, and so obviously horror was in my blood. And if you're a fan of King, you're going to be a fan of short horror, because
Sure.
that's his collections are amazing. And that kind of that was always kind of there. And my first novel that I'd ever written, actually, it's called Darling. It's a Bad Place novel that came out in 2012. It's currently being adapted for a film. And
congrats.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, that's a roller coaster, man. Let me tell you. But yeah, so horror's always been there. It's always been something I've been into. I remember my grandmother, when I was a kid, we'd stay up late and watch horror movies. And so when I first heard about the Horror Writers Association, when I first moved to Los Angeles, I was interested in it. And then I found out that I lived around the corner at the time from the then current vice president, Lisa Morton, who's also a fantastic author.
Sure. Yep.
And so I reached out to Lisa, and she was like, "Oh yeah, we've got tons of volunteer opportunities," because it's mostly volunteer run org, and just immediately got sucked in. And everybody at the organization is wonderful and passionate, and I've met some of my best friends through there, and have just stuck around ever since.
Well, and with an organization like this of basically authors helping other authors, which is just terrific to have that sort of support system for writers, because as we know in the publishing industry, it is feast or famine, and more times famine than feast, unfortunately. What special challenges, if any, do horror writers seem to confront in the marketplace?
The horror genre, especially with publishing, is, like you said, feast or famine. Like it's boom or bust. We'll go through periods where horror is incredibly popular, and everybody is just trying to get their hands on as much horror as possible. And then it seems like overnight the genre will die, and it becomes poison to say you're a horror writer for a few years, as far as publishing is concerned. We went through a stint, I remember back when I first started volunteering for the org, where everyone's books were marketed as supernatural thrillers. You couldn't say horror. You could say supernatural thriller, so things like that. But I do think that not only are we in a great place now, I kind of feel, I hope at least, fingers crossed, that we might be past that. I feel like with the rise of services like Shudder and Netflix leaning so hard into horror, that horror is just kind of more in the public consciousness. And I think people have broadened their expectations of what horror is. I think for a long time, the genre suffered under a stigma that it was all, busty women in bikinis being hacked up by a masked guy with a machete, and yes, there is that, but that's such a small piece. I mean, to me, that's one of the great things about the horror genre, is that it's a genre where you can have Silence of the Lambs. You can have The Haunting of Hill House.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
You can have Turn of the Screw, and then you can also have Friday the 13th Part 8.
Yeah.
Like, there's such a huge umbrella as to what constitutes horror that I it always boggles my mind when people say that they don't like horror, because it's like, man, there's something in there you like. And when you start talking to people that say that, like, you usually find that there is something they love and they just never thought of it as horror.
And you start thinking of all the so-called classic authors, your Edith Whartons, your Henry James, your Ambrose Bierces, who have written in the genre as well, right? So this is not, it seems, I sometimes I try to tally whether I've read more horror novels in my life or espionage thrillers. And I think if I take the full cast of my life, it's horror, because of course, when you're a young man between the ages of 12 and 18, you read everything that Stephen King wrote 10 times over. But it just seems to be, it seems to be denigrated so many times because of what you talk about, the stereotype, when you just realize, well, so many of the past masters have also played with horror and the horror tropes in so much of their fiction. And so it's unfairly, to me, it seems like it gets pushed to the side.
Yeah. And, I think a big part of that was the rise of modern marketing. Because like you said, like so many of the past masters, I've got a book on my shelf that's just a collection of horror and fantasy short stories that F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote.
Wow.
Which, most people would not think, oh, the guy who wrote Great Gatsby was really into horror, but he was, But as, marketing became more prevalent and you had to get these covers, the one that always sticks out in my mind is Jack Ketchum had written a novel called The Girl Next Door that
sure,
a very disturbing adaptation of a true story of this mentally ill woman and how she had kidnapped a teenager in her neighborhood. And but he was so unhappy with the cover because when the book was published in the 1980s, the cover was a skeleton cheerleader with pom-poms, which says nothing about this very serious book, but that was kind of like the marketing idea behind it. And I think that that went some way toward it. And also, being involved in the film industry, when horror is doing well, it's an easy cash grab. It's a genre where you don't have to have big name actors, so you can do cheaper films. And so there have been a lot of horror movies made by people who don't actually want to make a good movie. And I think that's contributed to it too.
Oh, sure. Well, and it's funny you mentioned the kind of the 70s mass market paperback approach to horror. And now, coming full circle, of course, Grady Hendrix with his Paperbacks from Hell, where he, reintroduces all those covers. And then I picked up Josh Mallerman's Goblin a few weeks back, and that has a very 70s cover vibe to it, right? So it's like the industry at times seems to tack back into it, say, hey, this is now nostalgia. What was once kind of putting us in the bin is now something that people actually want to kind of remember fondly as, oh yeah, those were the covers of my childhood. Those were wonderful books.
Yeah. And I feel like that too with like old VHS covers. I remember being a kid and going into the video store and sneaking over into the horror aisle and just, like darkly intrigued. Like, I know this is going to give me a nightmare, but I have to stare at this cover.
So what do you think people misunderstand about the horror genre?
Both its breadth and its depth. One of the things I love about horror that's always drawn me to it is I feel it's an incredibly, when done well, an incredibly deep genre that allows us to deal with topics that are otherwise difficult to deal with. You take a famous example, for instance, The Shining. The Shining is a story about a man struggling with his alcohol addiction and how that impacts his family. If you'd written that as a straight drama, it would be melodramatic and wouldn't have the punch that it does, and we wouldn't be talking about it 45 years later, but using the device of the haunted house and everything King brings into that as a metaphor for Jack's alcoholism, it has this incredible staying power and really allows you to deal in depth with it in a way that would be incredibly difficult if you did it outside the genre. I remember Harlan Ellison, I think it was Harlan Ellison, said once that specifically talking about death, that horror is a genre that allows us to deal with a subject that we can only deal with through our imagination. Mm. And, I find that with my own work. I've unfortunately had some tragedies and have lost some people in my life. And, one way that I deal with that is through writing. And, more often than not, when you're dealing with that subject matter, it gets pretty dark. And so I think it's a natural place that it goes to horror.
I think kind of along those lines too, there's like a misconception that horror writing is like flat, and it's not. Like, it's all about the story and it's not about the actual craft of writing. And I don't think that's the case at all, but like people who don't delve into that genre like wouldn't know that, because everything that like you see on the surface is maybe actually like not great. But what would you say to somebody who like is opposed to reading horror because they think that the writing is actually bad?
That they have picked the wrong books in the past. I mean, just like any genre, you had mentioned reading espionage novels. Like there's a big difference from picking up an airport paperback and reading John le Carre.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And I mean, I think that goes for any type of book. And it's, again, the marketing. I think horror in the past, maybe some of those not great stylists have been marketed very hard. Because again, it's easy sells, when you're talking about airport books or at picking up something at Walmart or whatever, where you're like, I just want a quick, breezy read and I want to get scared for Halloween, I think those things have tended to do well in the past. But I do see, like you'd mentioned earlier, before we jumped on, writers like Stephen Graham Jones become popular. There's definitely a shift. Like the popular horror fiction now, I feel is dominated more by writers who can not only plot and create depthful characters, but who have kind of a lyricism to their prose that's incredibly enjoyable.
Yeah, and we actually had about a month ago the head of the Wisconsin Historical Society Press, and she and I are both big Stephen King fans. So we spent the first 10 minutes of what was supposed to be about editing just talking about Stephen King books. And one of the things that she noted along the lines of what you're talking about is she said, there are a few authors writing today who write young men as well as Stephen King, and the complexities of young men and the drama of young men and what they're feeling and going through and suffering through. And just that characterization right there, you get that depth of character. And certainly with Stephen Graham Jones, I had the same, he's telling stories on multiple levels, obviously, that he's telling a horror story, but then he's also telling stories about the indigenous peoples of this country and the suffering that they have dealt with and the things that they continue to deal with in the contemporary age, but all framed in this horror novel setting, which makes them very readable, but also very deep.
Yeah. And, another thing with writers like that is, like with King, for instance, not only does he write young men really well, he writes blue collar poverty very well. And that's not something you get out of a lot of writers, because, most writers, especially who are successful at his level, they're coming out of Ivy League schools, they don't actually experience that side of America, but that's where King grew up. And while I've never been to Maine, I grew up in East Tennessee, an incredibly poverty-stricken area, did not grow up with any money at all. I remember, counting pennies out of a couch to buy ramen noodles. And, so when I read King and I see these characters, they're real to me. And it's something you don't get to see in a lot of fiction, at least in a way that feels real. A lot of times when you see it, it's people from the outside looking in at what it's like to grow up there. But with King, it's like you can immediately tell, like, he knew these people, he grew up with these people, he grew up in this situation. And I've always found that like one of the things that's really gripping about his work.
Yeah, one of the things that I've said, and I mentioned it on that last podcast, and I'm sure it's something that I will get letters from academics around the world about how wrong I am. And not to dwell too much on King, but one of the things I've held long is he's really our Dickens. Because if you think about what Dickens was writing about, the underclass and the people who weren't being represented in society and the troubles of society, King takes a similar aim. He does it like Dickens did. Dickens was using melodrama. King is using horror, plot-driven story to expose bigger stories about ourselves along the way.
Absolutely. And talk about another classic writer who dove into the horror genre.
Oh,
Dickens.
Yeah, absolutely.
You ever read The Signalman?
Yes.
Oh, that's a creepy story.
Yeah. Oh, all of his ghost stories are super creepy.
Oh, yeah.
He's just so good on atmosphere. It's wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the I don't know if this is maybe the subgenres is the right term. Like if you have horror as the umbrella, like what are some of the genres like under that umbrella that people might not necessarily associate with horror writing?
Yeah, that's a good question. Because I think, like I was saying earlier, I think things like slasher and splatterpunk is what a lot of the general public think of with horror, is just like, oh, there's going to be a lot of gore and blood. And those are subgenres. But you also have ghost stories. You have quiet horror has gotten really big. It's very character driven horror. And even if there's a supernatural element, it seems to deal more with the internal struggle of the characters.
Mm.
You get a lot to talk about prose stylings, like you get a lot of beautiful writing in quiet horror. Psychological horror. You've got, all your various different types of monsters, werewolves, vampires, etc. Gothic horror, a lot of comedic horror, which is a subgenre I really enjoy, having a comedy background too. But yeah, when you break it down, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if I sat down to make a list that there were over 20 subgenres of horror and wildly different from one another, I mean, again, like The Haunting of Hill House versus you compare that to Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And it's like those two things shouldn't on the surface be in the same genre, but yet they are.
Yeah.
That's kind of fascinating. I mean, to go back to a marketing thing, it used to be, I think back in the 30s, horror was actually, supernatural horror was a subgenre of fantasy, while what we would consider more, I guess, like realistic horror, serial killers, slasher killers, those kind of things, was a subgenre of crime. There were actually two separate genres, but at some point, as horror became its own thing, these subgenres from other genres got pulled into one umbrella genre that just dealt with fear.
So like true crime would be under the horror umbrella, or is it not because it's technically nonfiction?
Yeah, that's where I've heard people argue one way or the other. I know publishers consider true crime its own thing, so marketing its own thing. But I have heard a lot of people describe that as nonfiction horror. So, but then you get into there's all sorts of arguments amongst horror writers and fans as to what is horror. Like you want to have an interesting discussion. Ask a horror fan if they think Jaws is horror.
Okay.
I think Jaws is a horror movie. It ticks all the boxes.
Absolutely.
But a lot of people will be like, no, it's an adventure.
No, you don't see the monster. You don't see the monster. You don't see, it's a classic.
Yeah. But I think that's one of the interesting things about the genre is it's very fluid. And to some extent, it's subjective. Some people don't consider Silence of the Lambs horror. I definitely do, but I've heard people say, no. That's that's crime. It's a thriller. And, but I think Lecter and Buffalo Bill are pretty horrifying. So
absolutely. Yeah, I teach a college class as well, and several of my students have been watching the Dahmer miniseries on Netflix, the documentary, and without a doubt, the way they're describing it, it is horror. It is not. Yeah. It's not just pure nonfiction true crime. It is horrific, and some of them have been saying, "Oh, they had the most disturbing thing they've ever seen." Including slasher movies that they've ever seen that really sticks with them.
Yeah, I could imagine. I haven't watched it yet. Dahmer freaks me out.
Yeah. Well, what does scare you? I guess that's a good question for a horror writer. What gives you the creeps?
Um, since I've become a parent, anything with kids, like I remember watching The Exorcist for the first time after having children, and it plays so differently. Like that was always one of my favorite movies, but after having kids, you watch it from the mother's perspective in a different way, and it's a whole different kind of scary. Or like Pet Cemetery, I tried to reread Pet Cemetery when my youngest was 3, the same age Gage is when he dies in the book. Spoiler alert for 40.
Yeah, for anyone not read it to this point.
Yeah. But I got to, King does that thing where he loves to just tell you what's about to happen. And there's this nice chapter where Lewis and Gage are out in a field and they're flying a kite, and it's just this beautiful father-son moment. And then it gets to the end of the chapter and he says, 3 months later, Gage would be dead. And I was like, nope, I'm done. I can't read this.
Yeah. I had a similar experience when I had a child. I could not read that book again. It was one of my favorites, but it just horrific.
Yeah. And it's such a, that's one, talk about depth in horror. I think a lot of people, especially because the film adaptations, they think that that's just, it's this zombie gore thing, but like it's an incredibly deep look at the horror of losing a child. And anybody who's gone through that, like that book is just eviscerating. And then on the flip side, in kind of a silly way, ghosts creep me out in a way that like other things don't. Like I used to box, and I did mixed martial arts, and like I power lift now. So like the idea of like, some psycho with a knife or something coming at me, it's like, oh, well, I can at least fight him back. Right. But like the idea of something that you can't touch, popping up while you're asleep, like that creeps me out.
Yeah. Listeners, you will now have nightmares of, looking under your bed at 2 a.m. because of the creepies that are under there.
If I can't punch it, I'm afraid of it.
I totally understand that. What sort of trends are we seeing? I mean, you mentioned Stephen Graham Jones, but what trends are we maybe seeing in horror fiction these days?
I do think quiet horror is growing, like I said. And to talk about Stephen Graham Jones, I think we're getting a lot of horror from typically underrepresented communities and writers. And it's an interesting thing in the genre. Like we've always had a little bit of that. Al Going back. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him, but he's a Native American writer who's been working in the genre for probably 30 years, but it never achieved the level of recognition that Stephen Graham Jones has. So there's always been a little bit of that in the genre, but I feel like it's really exploding right now. There are a lot of writers of color coming through and having great moments. Victor Laval.
Read him. Yep. Yeah, very fantastic. Much in that. Oh gosh, why can't I, of course, now think of the author that he's basically kind of carrying into the 21st century, the classic.
Lovecraft.
Lovecraft. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that's a writer you want to talk about, like ideas over writing, and I'll get a lot of flack for this, but Lovecraft was not a good writer. But you talk about ideas, like his ideas have had such staying power. I think that's why a lot of writers like Victor are attracted to him. It's like, well, what if you took that and actually wrote it well? But yeah, so we're getting a lot of these kind of great moments. And that's kind of been interesting with the horror genre as a whole. The new Hellraiser series that's on Hulu. There's been this weird kind of backlash from a certain segment of America about how queer it is. And it's like, have you never read Clive Barker? It's like in the early 80s, I mean, he was pushing the envelope and a bestseller. Middle America, the people who are complaining about this stuff had to be buying his books up in droves because of the sales. And and that's something that's kind of an interesting thing about the horror genre is it's always been transgressive in that way. It's always pushed the boundaries. It's as though you can explore topics and subject matter in horror years before you can explore them in other genres. And I've always found that fascinating. Of course, Barker is another one of my favorite writers, though. So,
we're running slightly short on time, but I'm gonna stick in a craft question here because I really want to know the answer, especially based on your bio. What is your approach to writing like mood and atmosphere like? Because I think that's something that horror does really, really well that other genres do not, because it almost is like required. Like we need to feel like we're there to be invested in the story. And that's maybe not necessarily as needed in some other genres. But I think it's something that is really hard to do well. And I'm curious, like, what you do to get into that space in your own writing.
I try to creep myself out, basically.
Immersion therapy.
Yeah. I think of, what would get me in real life, and I kind of put myself in that place where you've watched a scary movie, you're home alone, you're going upstairs to brush your teeth, it's dark, you look down the hallway, the hallway is shadowed, the door is creaked open a little bit, it's black in there, what's in there? You hear it dripping from the bathroom, and just all these sounds are magnified. And I kind of put myself in that place. I try to think in all the senses, not just sight, but sound is a big one in horror. But people also often neglect the tactile, and smell. These things can be very powerful for creating an atmosphere. And then I just try to have patience, because you want to. I think this is true with any writing. You want to cut to the chase, right? Like, what's the exciting thing I'm leading up to, and you want to get to it quickly. But I think to create the atmosphere, you have to slow down and be patient and slowly build to that moment.
That's very helpful, because I think that so much of the time that patience adds tension too. Like we're like, like we can feel something's going to happen, like there's going to be a shift, but the longer you draw that out, and I guess it's a fine line, right? But the longer you draw that out, the more on edge your reader's going to be.
Yeah, because the reader knows something scary is going to happen.
Yeah.
It's this whole thing. Hitchcock used to say that he would talk about creating tension. He's like, you have a man sitting at a table talking to another man, and let the audience see that there's a ticking bomb under the table that neither of the men are aware of, and they just keep having their conversation. And we, the audience, are like, when's that bomb going to blow? When's that bomb going to blow? And every 30 seconds, we're just getting more and more crazy about this bomb going to blow, and the characters don't know.
Yeah. No, it's super cool.
Well, speaking of things that scare us and creep us out, that's now our favorite part of every episode. Hey, what you reading? Where we talk with our guest about one or two books that maybe they're reading or would highly recommend. And of course, because we've been talking about horror fiction today, the recommendations today go to horror. So, Brad, we'll start with you. What are you reading, or what would you recommend to readers?
Well, I'm actually rereading. We've been talking about Stephen Graham Jones, The Only Good Indians, which is a fantastic novel. Highly recommend that. One of my perennial favorites, I've probably read this book 10 times, and it's not uncommon for me to pull it off my shelf come Halloween, is Salem's Lot by Stephen King. One of the creepiest books I've ever read. Maybe it's because I first read it when I was way too young to be reading Stephen King. But there's just something in that book that I constantly drawn to and just keep coming back, and really creeps me out. I've also been reading lately a lot of John Palisano. He's the current president of the Horror Writers Association. He has some fantastic short fiction. Highly recommend that. We'd mentioned Victor Laval. The Changeling is an amazing.
Yep, love that.
That's a great book.
Anything by Grady Hendrix, really good. Josh Mallerman. I think you'd mentioned Goblin.
Yep.
A lot of people are probably most familiar with him from Bird Box, which adapted on Netflix. Fantastic writer. Paul Tremblay.
Cabin at the End of the World.
Yeah.
That's another one for parents. That's a tough slog.
Oh man, tell me about it. Well, and his first big novel too, Oh, what was the title?
About the girl, the family, and it was just re-released.
Yeah, with the possession.
The ghost, the ghost in the head, something in the head. I can't remember the title, but I know
Head full of ghosts.
Head full of ghosts. Head full of ghosts.
Yes.
Yep, there we go.
Yeah, that is a creepy.
Yes,
book.
that is.
Again, one as a parent, it's like, ugh.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, that's a great list. That's a wonderful, wonderful list. How about you, Kateri?
So I chose a couple. I went to classics. So I'm Rebecca, one of my all-time favorites by Daphne du Maurier. I think when we started this conversation, I was like, oh no, I don't know what I'm going to pick because I don't like read scary books. And then as we were talking, it occurred to me that like my perception, like so many people's of the genre, is really narrow. And I was like going through my Goodreads and I was like, I could just like 5 books for this. So Rebecca's my first pick because it's like an all-time favorite and I love it. And the writing is excellent and the atmosphere is excellent. And basically the whole thing is excellent. I also chose Wuthering Heights because I think it's a book that we don't necessarily often think of as horror, but it's gothic and it's creepy and the characters are creepy, and this setting, I think, in that book is really excellent. And then my last book, which I kind of shoehorned in at the end after we were talking, is The Collector by John Fowles. I don't know if this necessarily is categorized as horror, but it's like about this guy who's kind of a loner and he's a butterfly collector, and then he abducts this girl, and it's like the progression of their relationship. And it's super creepy, but it's also one of those books that, like, I guess if it's in the genre, it's probably that quiet horror because it's, I don't know, it feels very like slow moving, but it's really scary and weird. So those are my picks. What about you, Sam?
Well, I've got a few too. I've got a one that I don't think a lot of people consider horror, but really creeped the heck out of me, which is a book by a Japanese author named Yoko Agawa, which is called Revenge: 11 Tales of 11 Tales of Suspense. But it's this series of interconnected short stories about revenge and about obsession. And what you don't see is how all these stories tie together, but they do by the end. And that one just stuck with me because I love short fiction, but it was also creepy as heck. And just the way that she wrote it in such a very quiet style was just terrific. And then I'll go for a classic here. We mentioned the Haunting of Hill House, which I love, but a book I actually like better, which had a similar approach, is Hell House by Richard Matheson. It's another one of those challenge people to, stay in a scary house and you get money or, but boy, Richard Matheson, just what a great writer of supernatural fiction. And what I just love about his stuff is how it's just grounded in the suburban life of us all, right? So that anybody can be the creepy person in this whole thing. But that book just really gave me the creeps. And then just one for Halloween that I read several years ago, but I've read it a couple times since around this time. I just love this one because of the Halloween nature of it. It's a book called Dark Harvest by Norman Partridge, which is about this character named October Boy, that was all the characters hunt down, and it's just a real. Don't want to spoil too much on this, but it's a real, true Halloween book, and it's just really well written. I've read some other of his short fiction. Just a nice craftsperson in terms of his writing.
Cool. Lots of good suggestions.
Absolutely. Well, no doubt that our listeners can go and get really creeped out with a lot of these titles here. Well, Brad Hodson, thank you so much for joining us. This was an absolutely wonderful conversation. We really, really appreciate it.
Where can readers find?
Yeah, go ahead, Kateri.
Oh, I was just curious if you would tell readers where they can find your books.
Yeah. So, like most places, most people, easiest to find on Amazon, but use an indie site if you can. But IndieBound
is a great site to use if you need to find a local bookstore that'll have them.
Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah. So, Where Carrion Gods Dance is a collection of short fiction, all horror and dark, very Halloween themed. Um, my first novel, Darling, you can probably find a used copy of that somewhere. That's a very bad place story. Basically, a haunted apartment building, though something else is going on that I won't spoil. And then Life on the 64 Bus, which is not horror, as you were saying, it's a book about misfits and kind of broken people coming together while performing these cons and heists in Rome. It's very kind of in the vein of like James Gunn movies, like Guardians of the Galaxy minus the science fiction. You know, kind of these like messed up broken people discovering that they're a family and that they need each other.
Nice.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you joining us.
Yeah, thanks again for having me on. This was fun.